This episode of the Missions Podcast is sponsored by Reformation Heritage Books, publisher of How to Lead Your Family by Dr. Joel Beakey, a concise, practical guide to biblical leadership in the home. Use the code LEADABWE, all caps, at rhb.org to get 20% off now through September 30th. Greetings and welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Communications and Engagement with ABWE, joined once again for another exciting expedition into the cavernous terrain of missiology and theology by none other than the Scott W. Dunford, hailing from Western Hills Church in San Mateo, California. And thank you for joining us as well. If it's your first time, you can get more content at missionspodcast.com. You can also join our premium club that is at missionspodcast.com/premium. Or if you're an Apple Podcast listener, you can get it directly in the app. And that'll give you access to our bonus content that we record every week, including this week. We'll give a preview of that as we go on. And we'd love to hear from you as well. If you have any questions at all for us as hosts, you can email alex@missionspodcast.com. We love your suggestions. Scott, I'm excited for our topic today. It's one we've hit on a few times. You and I love to think about history. We love to think about the right way to understand culture in light of Scripture and God's common grace in culture. And this topic kind of gives us a glimpse of that as well. And I'm excited to talk to today a new friend of mine, Dr. David Talcott. We made each other's acquaintance back at the conference that we both attended a few months ago here in Baltimore and spent some time hanging out together along with Chris Wiley, another friend of the show. So David, thanks for joining us today. And we'll give you a proper introduction, brother. So Dr. David Talcott serves as Fellow of Philosophy, Graduate Dean, and Director of the MA program at New St. Andrews College. He joined the faculty in 2023 after 12 years at the King's College in New York, where he rose from assistant to associate professor of philosophy. You're a graduate of Indiana University with your PhD. You've done scholarly work focused on ancient Greek philosophy, particularly Plato, and you've written for sites like First Things. You also have a book on Plato released by P&R Publishing and a former ruling elder in the PCA. And also, you are a husband, which is critically important, married to Anna, and you have 7 children, 3 sons and 4 daughters. Did we get all that correct, brother?
That's all correct. Thanks, Alex.
Well, it's so good to have you on today. We've talked about this before. As missionaries, as people thinking about missions, we look at a passage like Acts chapter 17, and we realize, okay, there's a lot that goes into how someone like the Apostle Paul approaches understanding his culture in ancient Greece and Rome and that context of the first century, and then how missionaries should approach cultures today. So let's dive into it. But one of the questions that's come up multiple times in the history of the church, famously, has been asked, what hath Athens to do with Jerusalem? In other words, what does this ancient Greek philosophical context have to do with Scripture, if anything at all? There's some people that would say the two have nothing to do with each other at all. How would you answer, brother?
Well, you've asked a very big question. I think at one level, the question, you could restate it a couple ways. I would say it's a question like, what does nature have to do with grace? Mm-hmm. Or what does creation have to do with redemption? I think those are parallel questions. What does natural revelation have to do with special revelation? I think these are kind of parallel questions, right? Because God acts both in creation and in redemption. He reveals himself both through creation and through his Son. And so, likewise, I think there's a world of nature that we explore through philosophy, and then a world of grace that we only receive through Christ and through Scripture. And so the two, I think, ideally should work together in harmony, just like nature and grace work together in harmony. Nature can't work without grace, but grace does not obliterate nature. And likewise, Athens can't be good without Jerusalem, but Jerusalem doesn't come to destroy Athens. It comes to help Athens flourish and do well in what it is. So that's very preliminary, but I think there are some boundaries or guidelines there that, or at least the starting point for answering how these two can relate to each other in a good way.
We have this really interesting, story in the Bible in Acts chapter 17, of course, where
Yeah.
Paul goes to the Areopagus. He's preaching. Some scholars say that he's following just the pattern of Socrates when he spoke there. And he begins quoting the different Greek poets, and shows that he has quite an extensive knowledge, not just here in Athens, but other places of Greek philosophy, of Greek poetry, of the culture of that era. And he's addressing the men of Athens in ways that they immediately knew what he was trying to do. So that kind of begs the question for us today. And I think missiologists love to study Acts 17 as kind of a paradigm possibly of one way to engage a culture. So I guess the question for you today in this regard would be, why should a missionary care about philosophy? Why should a missionary study classical philosophy particularly? Is that still relevant for us?
Acts 17 is such a rich text for us to think about apologetics and to think about bringing the gospel to a different kind of place. And Paul himself is such an interesting model for us in what a pastor and missionary should be like. If you think about his background, he was incredibly well educated, right? We know that he received the kind of most elite Jewish education that's possible in the scriptures. We know that he was a Roman citizen, born outside of Israel, and so it's clear that he has a lot of learning that he did when he was young. He didn't just go out on the mission field having not been intellectually prepared, let alone spiritually and personally and ethically and so forth, but intellectually prepared, both regarding what the scriptures teach and regarding the culture that he was going to be encountering. So I don't think he could do what he did in Acts 17 without really extensive study of what is going on in the world around him. As you mentioned, he does seem to be pretty knowledgeable about these philosophical movements. We have the Stoics and the Epicureans explicitly mentioned. So these are two of the more prominent intellectual schools of philosophy at this point in the ancient world. Athens was no longer the power center that it was a couple hundred years earlier. Rome is, of course, the prominent power center, but it's still intellectuals, right? And he is bringing the gospel to people that are very thoughtful. They're also very pagan, and he's not afraid to offend them. He's not afraid to say things he knows that they won't like, and he's not afraid to get laughed out of the room in the end of it, which is what happens. They escort him out. So the courage he shows, the wisdom he shows, the confidence he shows in Jesus is really remarkable. Those, I think, are the kinds of lessons to pull out. I think a model from Acts 17 is we should understand what's going on around us today. I do think studying classical philosophy is useful. I'm happy to opine on that, but its emphasis would be on, Paul didn't necessarily study the Egyptians the way that he studied the Epicureans and the Stoics. So I do think, although this is bad for my own business, I would say it's important for missionaries to know what's going on today intellectually, not just 2,000 years ago. Now, that being said, I'll say one more thing. I know I've been talking for a minute. I'll say one more thing about that. The ideas of today come from the past. So things didn't spring into, being out of nothing intellectually, just like they don't physically. And so the movements today came out of the last 100 years, which came out of the last 500 years, which did come out of the last couple thousand years. And to understand it, you have to look to the past. And I do think even the classical past, there's a lot to learn from. You mentioned I wrote this book on Plato. I wrote it very accessibly with readers, with sort of a college education in mind to be able to approach it. And I try to show in that book the way that there is a collision of worldviews in the ancient world, even among the pagans. Not all pagans are the same. And some pagans seem to possess more common grace than others. and Plato being one who really has a lot of the right enemies. And you see a collision of worldviews on things like, is materialism true? Is relativism true? Is skepticism true? If not, how can we know that those are false? And Plato and Aristotle and others deploy arguments against those really destructive worldviews. And so I think if you think materialism is still a real thing, then the classical world has something to teach you. If you think relativism and skepticism are still real things today, the classical world has something that you can learn from.
So let me ask a follow-up question if I can. You mentioned that there's more common grace in some ancient figures than in others. That's true. In the missions world, we talk about this idea of a peace child, right? There's sometimes there's symbols that are embedded in a pagan culture that somehow providentially, when the gospel arrives, those become vehicles, those become preparatory means that allow the gospel to find a hearing. And we can look and I wonder if, and I'd love for you to speak to whether or not and to what extent Greek philosophy did that same thing in the ancient world. And then, of course, by extension, should we look for that same thing to be happening in our midst today? So one maybe other way of putting that question is, were these prophets? Paul calls Epimenides of Crete in Titus 1:12. He calls him a prophet, one of their own prophets, one of the Cretans' own prophets. Is he just saying that facetiously, or does he really mean that in some sense these ancient sort of soothsayers were actually speaking, maybe not on behalf of the God, but at least on behalf of their gods in a way that God was active in somehow? Give us some categories to think through this.
Yeah, well, I don't think Epimenides was a real prophet. I'll just say that. He was considered a prophet by his people, but you could say he's a prophet in the sense that he told the truth. He's a truth teller, but he's not a prophet like, the Apostle John was or something. So that being said, now there really are things in different cultures that show people's need for God, their desire for God, their hunger for God. This is even in Acts 17 in verse 27, which says, starting in the middle of the sentence, that they would seek God if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he's not far off from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we also are his children. So everyone everywhere was made for God. And so there are going to be resonances and symbols in different cultures. And I like you mentioned, that's going to look different. And some are in better shape than others. Some are more corrupt than others. I think that's easy to see at one level. I mean, not all pagan neighbors are equal, right? Some mow their lawns, take out their trash, say hi to you in the morning, and others throw loud parties and throw their trash in the front yard. And you're like, this is miserable. And they could both be pagans. And yet one is very clearly has been given more common grace in a way than the other. And so I think that's true intellectually as well. And the Greek philosophers, there are certain things which really are harmonious with the Christian picture. And I mentioned materialism. I would say for Plato, as an example, that's one place that he really was right, that the material, because he argues that the material world comes from the spiritual world, that the spiritual world is more original and fundamental. How well does he understand that spiritual world? Well, not as well as he could. That's a lot. That's something to talk about. But boy, in a culture where there were a growing number of skeptics and materialists, he was like, no, that's not all there is. Just look around. You can't explain the world just from the principles of matter. And that, I do think, was a kind of preparation for the gospel. As you mentioned, there's a lot, actually, a real history of interpreting Greek philosophy this way in the church as a kind of preparation, natural preparation for the gospel. Right. Kind of putting a plausibility structure in place where people can understand the arguments. With that said, the first century is a mess. The first century is a real mess. And the Stoics and Epicureans that Paul is talking to in Acts 17, they're not Platonists, they're materialists. They were materialists. They didn't believe in a resurrection. They didn't believe in a persistence of the soul after death. And so they were very corrupt themselves. They weren't polytheists the way that kind of the popular religion around them was. We think of the Roman gods and the Greek gods. Those were still kind of the popular religion, the stories from the literature of the time.
Right.
So the philosophers didn't buy those fanciful stories of these corrupt gods, but they were materialists themselves. So it's a intellectually diverse world in the first century AD, just like today. It's an intellectually diverse world.
It sure is. And speaking of good books to get into, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, and then Scott, I'll let you cut in and ask our friend here another question. But if you're looking for more good books to read, well, we've got one to tell you about. But if you're looking to be a better man, and who doesn't want to be a better Christian man, a better leader, a better husband, a better father? I know I do. And in How to Lead Your Family, Dr. Joel Beakey offers a biblical and practical guide to leading in the home as a prophet, priest, and king, just like the Lord Jesus Christ. Drawing from his decades of pastoral and family life experience, this short little volume, and it's adorably sized. It'll fit in your pocket. It's not too heavy. This short read is packed with wisdom and encouragement to help men lead with conviction and with grace. You can go to rhb.org, Reformation Heritage Books, and use the code LEAD, ABWE, all caps, to get 20% off your order. And for first-time customers, when you order, you'll also get an additional coupon for 10% off your next order. So go to rhb.org and check that out today.
I think for a lot of people, when they start talking about philosophy, they probably think back to some class maybe they had in college or maybe in high school that was boringly taught, didn't show relevance for today, and posited these questions that just seem completely irrelevant. And so they don't engage with it. And if you pick up, something, a dime book out of the used bookstore or St. Vincent de Paul's and start, flipping through Plato, it's an old version and it's hard to access and it's hard to see how it applies. So what advice would you give to the average person or even a missionary that's wanting to grow in this area of philosophy, that's maybe starting to understand, okay, this is how theologians have used philosophical language, and this is why it's important to help me think better? How would you advise them to get started in thinking wisely and engaging with this whole area of thought and philosophy?
Yeah, I can certainly understand that. Philosophy in some quarters is pretty bad today. Certainly in the secular universities, the kind of worldview of those who are teaching it and the things they argue for are pretty appalling. But yeah, even in a Christian setting, it can seem boring. I guess I've always found ideas very engaging, and something I think missionaries realize this actually, that people don't just act; they act for reasons. They have things they believe and think and desires that motivate them. And at its best, philosophy is kind of looking at creation, looking at nature, looking at what God made, and trying to understand how it ticks, how it works. It's like science in that way, and that is trying to understand really what are the principles that are operative here. So I guess my hope is that as you encounter some good philosophy, you're like, oh, I see what's going on here. I can see why this is relevant. In terms of approaching the classics, I would encourage looking at Augustine, the church father Augustine. His work, The Confessions, is very approachable. It's got a narrative structure to it. It's very devout and pastoral in how he approaches it, and it's a really beautiful mixture of kind of the heart and the head in the way that he writes it. So I would say Augustine is a great one to approach initially. So his Confessions, again, are super readable. And then for someone interested in kind of more of an overview, I would recommend R.C. Sproul, the late R.C. Sproul. His little book, The Consequences of Ideas, is kind of a short, accessible overview of the history of philosophy in kind of bite-sized chunks that you could get a little taste for, hopefully whet the appetite for looking further.
And he did a video series as well that he kind of overviews philosophy. That's very, very accessible. It's one thing amazing about R.C. Sproul is his ability to take very complicated ideas and make them seem so easy. And I would just add to this too. Like, I know we're talking about Greek philosophy, but I worked in Asia, and I think just being able to interact with Buddhist thinking, reading Confucius, for instance, being able to interact with some of those things, it gives you a hearing. I've seen more than once me starting to speak and unbelievers just slouching back in their chair and not really wanting to hear what I had to say until I brought up, here's what Buddha taught, and this is what Buddhist thinking says about some topic. And this is how Christianity, interacts with that and contradicts that. And you can see physically people change their posture and lean forward because you're talking about something that they have some familiarity with and you're addressing something that seems relevant to them. So I don't know. I just would add that too, even though we might not be talking about Asian philosophy today. It's very relevant, I think, when we're working with Asian cultures.
Well, that's a question that I've had essentially throughout this conversation is I could argue that there's something unique providentially in history about the way that God was preparing the known world, the Greco-Roman world of Gentile culture around the time of the first century. There's something unique about that as the gospel lands there, there's the sort of categories, plausibility structures, whatever you want to have, whatever you want to call them, that leads to the flourishing of the gospel at that point onward. It's something different when we approach other cultures today. So should we have almost the same sort of, book loving cosmopolitan spirit with all philosophies, or is there a special carve out that we have for classical philosophy from these cultures in particular? You mentioned at the beginning of the interview, like, okay, Paul wasn't quoting from ancient Egyptian philosophers. Should he have given himself to that sort of study, or do we make distinctions rather? Are there some that are more worth reading than others?
Yeah, I think there certainly are ones that are more accurate to creation than others. And those are ones that we're likely to potentially learn something positive about, the same way we would learn about the world, the same way we learn things from secular scientists as they study the world. Now, in certain areas, they really get things wrong.
Right.
But in other areas, they can be very insightful and observant and helpful. And I think that's the case in philosophy as well. Again, a big range. You're absolutely right that the church, after the New Testament era, after Christ came and suffered and died and rose again, spread predominantly in the Greek and Roman Latin-speaking worlds. And our primary historical evidence from church history is from those places. I do think there is some evidence that missionaries went east and went south and went to other places, to India and to Africa. But we certainly don't see Christian civilization develop there the way that we see it develop in Europe and the Near East. So
right.
It does seem like, for whatever providential reason, most of the history of the church has been in that area. And I do think, I don't have all the answers to that, but I do think that does point towards God having some purpose behind that. But it also might be that we're early in the historical record, and there was more happening in India or in Ethiopia than we've really uncovered at this point, and we'll find more. But that being said, the church today, and as it developed in the West, at least up till recent times, right? I mean, the evangelization of the world broadly happened through Western missionaries. I think in the last 500 years, I think to me that seems pretty clear. Whatever was happening in the ancient world, the modern, missionary movements have really changed the spiritual landscape through that. And they came out of the West, and the mindset of the West and the Christian civilization that was built in the West.
So I have to ask this. We're talking about these older sources. We're talking about being conversant with church history as well. We talked briefly about Augustine. What do you make of some of the movements now to retrieve this and to retrieve classical theology, classical theism, anyway, to at least become more conversant with these sources? Because I'm sympathetic to that movement. That's where I'm at. And yet at the same time, I've noticed, and maybe this just happens anytime anyone's exposed to a new idea, but you get so sucked into something, it makes people weird. And I'm not naming names, but some people get weird once they get that shiny new hammer. Everything looks like a nail, right? How would you encourage people to navigate that in the few minutes we have left?
Yeah, that's a great question. That happens a lot. Fads are incredibly, immersive. Someone writes a new book and all of a sudden all the missionaries are like, oh, we have to do it this way. This new book's amazing. And that happens in a lot of places. It happens intellectually as well. I would say the last 100, even couple hundred years has been pretty intellectually destructive. So
Mm.
think about Marxism and communism and like what that did to China, what that did to Russia. When you have a couple generations of communism, it just like really destroys the indigenous culture, right? It really destroys the local peoples in a just incredibly leveling and destructive way. And in a lot of ways, I think modernity has had a corrosive effect on Christian culture. That's a big claim. We could argue about it for a long time. Even though modern science has been amazing in terms of giving us a convenient life, modern intellectual movements have really been hostile to Christianity. And so I think we are in a moment where we need to recover a lot of things. That the way forward involves the way backward, and so I'm very bullish on that. I think that is a really positive thing, culturally, theologically, in so many ways. I could go on and on about that. How to avoid getting weird? That's a really good observation and exhortation. I wish I had a silver bullet on that. Being in a healthy community helps that a lot. That's hard for like a missionary on the field to deal with, I think. But knowing, having a network of people that are healthy, that can keep you a little grounded. Like, hey, I'm doing this thing. Hey, I'm reading this thing. What do you think of this? And if they're all like, you're insane, check yourself a little bit on that. Have people you trust. But I do think we are at a moment where modernity has dissolved a lot of things, and the intellectual movements and cultural movements and ways of life have dissolved a lot of old things in the last 100 and 200 years. I was just reading this morning about Europe's fertility rate as one example, and a chart that shows the number of children in the country of Spain, which has incredibly low fertility. It's just a downward arc. And so a lot of things in our world today are on a downward arc. And we've really got to get our heads above that and out of our moment, right? Get out of our moment to see something bigger and a different way to live, to glorify God, to spread his kingdom, to spread his word. So we've got to do retrieval work. We can't just do retrieval work, but we've got to do retrieval work and then really think about what does the church, Christian living, life today as God's people look like? Because we can't just look at the world around us.
And what you said there has so much balance. We have to look to the past. We also have to engage in whatever the battles are today, and not just be fighting 2,000-year-old battles. We have to be looking at the foreground and then way off into the horizon as well. So, David, thanks. And brother, how can people hear from you or maybe get access to some of the things that you've written and worked on?
Thank you. Yeah, my book is just called Plato. It's published by P&R Publishing. That's the best way to just sort of get introduced to some of this. Again, it's really accessible. I have a Twitter account, Talcott NYC, because I used to teach in New York City. And you can follow me there for a highly diverse and eclectic Twitter account with all kinds of things. I am working on a book on Aristotle for P&R, so you can watch for that on the P&R website. And
I like eclectic follows on X. You've piqued my interest.
Okay.
Very good. Well, thank you for joining us. And listeners, thank you for being a part of this. Stay tuned for our bonus episode. Get access now at missionspodcast.com/premium or in your Apple Podcast app. Scott, we're going to talk about how Homer can help us prepare for the mission field. You heard that right.
Nope.
Now, we're not talking about Homer Simpson.
And
I knew you would do that.
I was all ready for that.
I was ready for it. I was completely ready for it. But there's a different Homer who can. We're going to explore how that's even possible. If you have any questions for us or suggestions, give your feedback. And until our next episode, go make disciples of all the nations.